How many of you have had to programmatically rescue your customers from human error? Okay. How many of you found it painful? Okay.
I still have a site that was broken a week or two ago that I just haven't had to.
Okay.
I just hope you find someone else to.
Okay. The second question might not seem related, but it's related in concept. How many of you have some kind of need for an audit log of changes that are made to your site? For regulatory purposes or any other reason? Okay. My goal here is to talk about an approach that I have and pitch this approach and discuss whether or not this is something that might be appropriate at some future point in the Plone core. My initial goal, it was to demo an actual product. What I have here is a half-finished product that is well tested but has no user interface. So what we're going to talk about is what's going on under the hood, how I'm trying to solve this problem, what I've done before, and what I'm proposing we might be able to do. I'd like to spark a discussion. There's been some interest in this approach in discussions previously on Twitter and GitHub. So if there's any questions, my goal here is just to really get people thinking about the viability of this idea and whether or not it's something that we want to, as a community, consider. So my disclaimers here. First, this is an experimental approach. I'm developing this in an add-on that can be installed and uninstalled in Plone. It wouldn't necessarily be, if it was ever integrated into the Plone core via PLIP and standard release process, it would probably be refederated into a variety of different places, not necessarily into a single add-on to prevent any kind of package proliferation. But it is an unfinished work in progress. What I have working right now in the package with tests is a pretty reasonable backend for modification logging. It uses a variety of events for 4 different kinds of facilities. Those facilities are modification, deletion, addition, and moves or renames. So we'd have the audit log that would tell you for any of those 4 facilities which kind of, in last in first out order, and basically reverse chronological order, which changes were made, who made the change, what the content was. If it was a move, we want to do things like log the previous path and the current path, those kinds of things. So we're logging some very basic small metadata. We do some of this stuff in other places, like for modifications, we have the catalog, we have CMF editions. But in some cases, it's not going to be sufficient for the kinds of restores that we need to do. For the customer that I had to do these rescues for, they had some data that was stored in the ZODB that was not necessarily content-ish. It was the content item was a proxy to a lot of underlying ZODB data stored on that object that could be imported by ZEXP, but could not be simply just restored from something like CMF editions. So I want to pitch this idea. I say it's about undo, but really I don't mean undo. I mean restoration in the broader sense. Because when we talk about undo, there was a ticket or an issue that was put on GitHub some months ago asking for us to restore undo into Plone. We had this undo tab in Plone 3, or undo action. We can't do that because transactional undo in ZODB just doesn't really work in the real world for a variety of reasons. Because on any reasonably loaded site, after some time, you just can't get the undo to work. So I'm here to pitch an idea. I'm here to show you some of the way in which I manually, programmatically rescued my customer, and talk about the audit logging system that I've been working on, but also pitch talk about the need for a UI. I'm working on it. This is work in progress. I was hoping to have a little more finished before the conference, but this is something that I think that if there's interest in this, I'd like to spark discussion about. We'll look at the pieces, so we'll talk about them, and hopefully find some kind of practical way forward. So here's my motivations. There was a reasonable degree of interest and discussion previously on GitHub and Twitter. This happened after I'd gone through 3 different rescues for one customer. So these 3 rescues, one of them was a mistake that our customer service folks made in trying to help out our customer. The other was made by the customer themselves, and they got in what I'd say deep doo-doo because they gave themselves a situation where they made one modification that cascaded to dozens and dozens and dozens of content items. So we needed to actually restore more than one item at a time. And on top of this, this wasn't just a modification that affected content. It affected things like embedded indexes that we were storing using repose.catalog on each of these form items that we were trying to restore. The ZODB content that was stored underneath the content that had nothing to do with the content fields. So when we're talking about restoration, there was really only one option, and that was go back in time, grab the snapshot from last Tuesday, and do a ZEXP import of that. Now, rather than do that manually, piece by piece, from, say, a data backup, like an old data.fs that I've backed up, what we ended up using was ZC.before storage because we had this in the undo history. Now, our default right now is we pack to 7 days, and we knew that somebody called us on day 2 saying, we know we screwed up, and we get that call and we know that we have some fixed number of days to programmatically go in and rescue them with a production database without having to resort to going into backups. So what I found doing this over and over again was that this was repeatable. What we were doing was very patterned and very formulaic in terms of how I was programmatically solving this problem. That means I think we can have a user interface for this. And again, we can't use undo in the ZMI/ZODB sense to really undo things these days. So the basics of what we need to have some kind of audit logging system. Now, the goal here is to, and my approach at this point is to store this in the ZODB. There have been other approaches that people have had saying, hey, store this out of band, do things like, if you were logging all requests, like not just writes, you might do something like there's things out there, collective.firehose is the example that comes to mind. Something that might log to a separate database using an asynchronous queue. But in this case, what I'm interested in doing is simply just at the very end of things, when there's any kind of modification, using the event subscribers to capture that in a very small record inside the ZODB. So right now, logging is synchronous. It might be asynchronous in the future. That's to be determined. One of the concerns I have is that there are increased potential for conflict errors the way I'm doing it now. That's usually not a problem because we retry transactions in ZOP 3 times. However, if your transaction is very long running, you have a very expensive transaction. At the end of it, you have a conflict error because you're trying to insert something into a list. It's basically a queue of integers. It's sort of ridiculous that one little tiny thing is doing your entire transaction when it could be retried, the insertion could be retried easily. So there may be some opportunity for either using conflict resolution or asynchronous behavior to solve all this, but we're going to log all these 4 facilities: deletion, modification, moves, and additions. Those are all the different kinds of rights that we really care about. And when we think about moves, we're excluding additions and excluding deletions from the iObjectRemoved interface because that is notified in a variety of ways. But we'd log all of this independent of the catalog. We do it in annotations on the site. That's the way that I'm handling this right now. The handlers are simple. They call a logging system which adapts the site and uses annotations and built-in out-of-the-box content types. Now, there's a risk to that in that using out-of-the-box content types, data types, excuse me. So I'm using things like OOB trees, IOB trees, and persistent lists. And I'm not subclassing any of them. So in theory, my goal here is to make this an easily uninstallable product. By using those out-of-the-box data types, I'm making this fairly low risk. I just have some annotations that are stored in your site using standard data types. If you try this and then you uninstall it once this thing is ready and you don't like it, it can go away without being a problem. So the goal here is to have a testable, installable, and uninstallable add-on that can be a proof of concept to verify that this is a reasonable way to restore things from the past. So how we're going to use this. We have the core components I've tested. I have integration tests for a variety of things, including things like pruning the logs, but it still needs a good user interface. Outside of the core use case, the audit logging could be used for other things, like regulatory audit requirements. So for example, if you have HIPAA requirements, it doesn't solve everything because in some cases you might actually need to log things like views. Right now, we just use z2.log and collective.username logger to log all the authenticated users' access. And so in theory, from a regulatory requirement, if I was wanting to do something that was HIPAA compliant for healthcare privacy laws in the United States, what I would have to do, I could potentially get away with just using my z2.log plus some kind of audit log that I'm storing in the ZODB. But my UI plan here is enumerating things in views. And by enumerating, I mean we need to be able to view all those 4 facilities: modification, deletion, addition, and moves or renames. We need to be able to handle the fact that somebody might delete a parent object and you need to restore something that has a deleted parent. So we can handle all those cases potentially in restoration, but we also need to have a way to prune changes depending upon how long we want to keep history. So you may pack to 7 days, but maybe you want to keep 6 months of audit history. That could be up to you, and so how this would be used and how that would be automated potentially, like right now it would keep in perpetuity unless you used a view to go prune it. It's not very big, so I don't think it's that big of a deal to keep that information because these are small records. These are it's, you know, records with 4 different fields. They're very, very small metadata records. They're not going to take up a lot of space. They're not going to take up a lot of overhead. But anyway, you know, you're going to have the RAM overhead of having a few extra B tree buckets. But I may need to fix the conflict resolution strategy because we have a queue that basically keeps the order of these inserted records for each of those facilities, and that queue, it's not really a queue, it's more like we just do insert 0 into a persistent list. So we're basically doing it in LIFO order, but we need to avoid conflicts. And in order to do that, there's really, I actually have to do this either asynchronously or we have to look at doing under resolve conflict method on a subclass of persistent list. I don't want to do that now because that becomes yet some data type that you have to have in the package that potentially gets persisted that's not uninstallable. So I want to punt that to a future date. Log on every change. We want to log every change. We want to be able to filter changes by things like by path. So I want to see every change that happened in the folder foo/bar. So I want to be able to filter by path. I want to be able to filter by user. I want to know everything that somebody is, you know, that particular user has changed in the last 60 days. We want to be able to filter by date. Some of this filtering might be indexed, and some of this filtering probably won't be indexed. And that's okay because this is really an emergency facility. It doesn't necessarily have to be fast. And the records are small to iterate through. So I'm not trying to over-optimize this at this point. Filtering right now, it goes through every single record and just tries to find matches. So it's not an indexed filter. But the goal is to have a view that allows you to list in reverse chronological order all changes for that facility: modification, deletion, addition, or move. So for regulatory logging, you could have a data retention threshold before you prune anything. You could potentially never prune if you wanted to keep the audit trail forever. The change records are small, so there's very little risk to that. So I talked about the facilities that we would try to have, that we would have. Each item has, there's 2 items in an annotation that are stored. There's an IOB tree that stores the actual records, and there is a persistent list that stores the keys. The keys are automatically generated integers. So each of these 4 facilities have the ability to keep track of every change in insertion order. Each is going to log the following 4 things: UID, path, authenticated user, and timestamp. Right now that's local time. We may choose to do this in UTC. I haven't made a design decision on that yet. And also for things like moves, what we probably need to do is log both the path before and after the change so that we have the ability to restore something to its previous path. So what do we do with this? We fix human errors. Use ZC.before storage multiple times programmatically to fix these errors. And if you have something within your kept history, that's great. If you don't, you've got to resort to going into your backups. Hopefully you have reasonable backups or snapshots of some system that keeps some way for you to go back in time if you're not able to do it from your production database. In each of the cases where I've had to rescue a customer, it's been from the production database because it's been within that 7-day window. Because usually that oh no call comes very, very quickly once somebody realizes the scope of what they've done. So I'm creating a package right now called Plone.Wayback as a transitional package and as an experimental proof of concept. This is currently on my own GitHub account. I don't have the permission to create repositories on the Plone GitHub. So if anybody wants to create a repository for me, I will put it there and keep working on it. Also soliciting any kind of collaboration. If anybody wants to work with me on this, The general idea, Wayback, is in reference to the Wayback Machine. They named it WABAC, sort of like in reference to ENIAC when Mr. Peabody and Sherman was originally created as a cartoon. So it's a transitional add-on. It's half finished. It's probably going to get exploded and federated elsewhere if it ever is integrated into the Plone core. That's assuming that everybody actually likes this thing. And we are assuming that I would write a plip for this, assuming that there was sufficient interest in folks working with this, playing with this as an add-on that, yeah, I got positive feedback, I'll write a plip. I want this to be testable by users. I want it to be uninstallable in the meantime with a very little risk so that folks can give me good feedback. This is probably something that will be finished next week, at least in some very basic state. So it's not going to handle all the edge cases, but it should be able to handle basic things like restoring the version of content from last Tuesday, or undoing the deletion that you had last Monday, or whatever is within your actual transaction history in your production database. So we want to restore previous known good state before accidental deletion. Modification we potentially could do with CMF editions and other ways, but some of the problems are that CMF editions is dealing with only certain stuff. And so if my assumption is that I have things that CMF editions probably is not taken care of. So I'm believing, my belief is, I don't necessarily know this to be absolutely sure, I would probably trust going back using before storage to grab a copy of the content rather than using CMF editions for a rollback of some kinds of content. The goal is that the user simply just views the audit logs and says, or filters into the audit logs, finds the things they want, clicks a couple checkboxes, and clicks restore. That simple. Potentially more than one item at a time. So ZC before storage is a really interesting thing. It basically wraps your existing storage, whatever that is. That could be something that's ZIO, file storage, any RHEL storage, anything. It requires you to keep history. So if you're using a history-free storage, that's a problem for you. It requires you to keep enough history. My eventual goal would be to have the ability to point to some directory where you have a bunch of file storage instances that have some kind of naming convention where you could, ostensibly go back through and find stuff from your backups. But that's not in scope, and that would require some degree of configuration. It would require file naming conventions. There's a lot of things that I haven't thought about yet. I don't want to solve that problem quite yet. So mostly, I just want to undo things easily. So when that phone call comes in, I don't want it to be 3 hours of me writing some script to fix it. I want to be able to tell a site administrator how to fix it. So programmatically using this, basically the way that you would use before storage without some kind of tool like this is you'd load the storage wrapper programmatically in a run script. You would use set site on the time traveled version, last Wednesday's snapshot of the storage. You'd get your content, you'd export it using the ZEXP functionality, probably to string IO or to a temp file, depending upon the size of the object. You'd then set site on the live target, that's the current version of the database. You'd restore it from ZEXP. You probably would have to do, there's a few other things that you have to do, like restore original. If you're using content creation APIs, you probably have to set things like the original UUID and potentially deal with int ID problems and other things that I haven't quite dealt with yet. But then you'd repeat that. And so what I'd like to show you at the end of this is some example code of how that's been done. But before I do that, a few disclaimers. First, you may want the ability to not undo things. Somebody comes to you and says, our site's been defaced by an employee, that employee's been fired, you need to delete this thing, and it needs to be permanent, and nobody can roll this back. So there needs to be the ability to sort of purge things from the undo history so they can't be rolled back even if they still are in the ZODB undo history. My vision right now is a site-wide audit logging facility that would only be accessible at the site root as a view to site administrators and manager roles. So you'd basically have to have some kind of superpowers to be able to roll things back. That's fine. I'd rather it be a site administrator than me as a programmer. We can make this placeful, meaning you could actually say, hey, I want to roll back things that are in this folder. But that needs some thought about permissions and local roles and other things that are not yet in scope. Next steps, I need to finish the user interface for enumeration, filtering, and pruning of the audit data. The back end is done, but the front end needs to work. I also need to come up with a reasonable tactic for avoiding the conflict, write conflicts on the key insertion for the audit logging. That, in terms of testing, is not a necessity, but if we were to do this in a large-scale production site with long-running transactions, I say long-running transactions. I really mean just a transaction that takes longer because you've got a you have a high level of concurrency and your database is in high use. We need views and adapters for restoration via before storage. So I'm working on that piece. That's basically taking what I've done programmatically, repetitively, in rescuing my users and trying to generalize it. We want to log the restorations themselves. So once you've actually restored something, we need to keep an audit trail of that too. And then if this proves universally useful, then I'll clip it. Before we get to questions, let's show an example of what using before storage looks like. You can also provide feedback with a link from 6 Feet Up. Let me go to, let's load this up. Hopefully I can end the show. I'll try to make this brief. And in the meantime, while I'm loading this, are there any questions?
Yeah. Is there currently any kind of undo feature in Plone? This is a totally new question.
There's the Xia My Undo tab. If you make a change that really, I wouldn't never recommend a user use it. No.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know that's why it was removed after Plone 3. I think it was Plone 3. When was it removed? Does anybody?
Yeah, I think Plone 3. One of the Plone 3s they removed it.
Okay, so yeah.
There used to be a user-facing undo button, but it used the Xia My Undo.
Once folks realized it didn't work half the time, I think that became a fairly sufficient motivation for the community to remove that. Now, I've used undo in the Xia My all the time, usually for stuff that I've done or stuff that somebody comes to me immediately and says, I made this mistake 30 seconds ago. I don't always have that luxury. So once time it's a function of the passage of time and the addition of more writes to the database, which is why time travel becomes a necessity.
There is undo on a single object.
Right, there's versioning. So you can revert to a previous version, compare versions with content. That's not always enabled by default on all content types, but it's available.
Okay.
Yeah, there are add-ons that let you use
So-
stuff.
I had another question.
Yeah, shoot.
So onto your UI dilemma.
Yeah.
So a very common scenario that I get is like somebody updates content.
Sure.
2 weeks later, somebody else says, "Oh, this is broken. What happened?" And nobody knows when it changed, but they know it changed from one state to another. So
Okay.
yeah, so you can't go in and search by a specific date or time, but you need to look through the content to figure out when it got messed up.
So the solution to that is you need to not just be able to enumerate all the changes that are made on a site, especially a busy site. You need to filter to specific path or users. In your case, you're saying you don't know who made the change, you don't know when it was changed, but you know this thing's screwed up.
Right.
Now, with modifications, I think you probably do have some, in most cases, with most content, you have some degree of history. Use it. If your workflow history on your object includes all the saves and changes, as well as things like state changes, then you absolutely have the ability to know, Joe did this 2 weeks ago, he's to blame, but we still have to fix this, and I know where to look by date. In this case, you're just saying, I know the content's screwed up, you're searching by path, right?
Either, yeah. So
Unless it was moved, and then you've got some other things to do.
file,
Yeah.
I mean, you know the page that's messed up.
Yeah.
But you don't know. It changes daily or
Yeah.
hourly or whatever.
There are some edge cases where you're going to have a needle in a haystack. I don't think if you can filter through these things, even if the filtering is somewhat slow, because you've got to go through, linearly search through all of these records and load them up for the past 6 months or whatever, or however you're retaining these things. I am envisioning this as a scenario where I say, hey, you've got a 2-week undo window, and beyond that, we're not doing anything. Your scenario might be, I don't know when they modified it, and maybe it's past that window, at which point you'd say, well, something like this really ought to support the ability to go into your stored backups. You can say, this is the directory where my backups are, and be able to pull things out of like load a file storage by naming convention, go in and use before storage to wrap that file storage, not your production database. But this is a reasonable thing to do. So I say, I have this specific, specific script that says I want to basically go to before this date, I want to use this specific rel storage database, and I want to wrap it with before storage. And this configuration becomes something that I then use to load before storage. So, then what I'm doing is getting two databases. I have, the current setup, and I also have this before storage, getting the database connection and the site root right here. And I'm doing set site on the source data while I retrieve it, and then I'm doing set site on the target data while I restore it, so that I can have access to local components in the respective time travel context. So my functions that are calling these things are typically passing in, source and target site, and they're doing specific things. But this is, the fact that I'm restoring these things is not germane to the larger discussion, which is we can just simply say, I have content items that need to be restored. And this is very easily generalized. So while this is a very specific run script that says, do this thing, grab these things, add them back into the site, manipulate them so that they look like what they looked like before, things like, change the UUID back to its original UUID, that sort of thing. All of this is totally generalizable. So there's no reason why we can't do this with a user interface that allows folks to filter through the audit history, click some checkboxes, and say, give me my stuff back. And that's the goal.
I'm wondering, is there anywhere a date you pass to the old storage so that you get the data from a specific date? I can't just see.
Yeah, so you have to. Okay, so I think the question is, how do you know the date for the before storage? So if you're clicking some checkboxes, you have to go back for each individual item. You may have to go back to a different date depending upon when it was modified. So you might have to load this storage multiple times. That's not unreasonable to do. It just, there's some overhead in doing that. But specifying the date, what you'd end up doing is you'd say, give me that modification date, subtract, add 1 second to that with a time delta, and then use that as your timestamp for things you want before. So you have some, reasonable guarantee that before, plus minus 1 second is basically what we're, plus 1 second is probably what we're looking at, because the timestamps in the ZODB, if I remember correctly, are not granular enough to do things at the millisecond level. So we're just saying, it's a little crude, but it's going to work most of the time. And that is, take the date of modification that was logged, add 1 second to that. Just to,
I'm not sure if
yeah.
the timestamp
Yeah.
of the transactions are, I think they're granular. I don't know it, but are you referring maybe to the...
Well, okay, so yeah, there is, I should be clear. There is a risk here. If the transaction takes a long time to commit and your event logger logs something, 1 second may not be long enough. If it takes 5 seconds between the time that the event logger gets a date and the transaction puts a timestamp on that specific transaction, you do have a problem with that drift, that specific, I can't predict what that's going to be. So I need to experiment with it. It's a challenge.
I think the zope time function that gets used for that stuff has a fixed time once the transaction starts. Like you can call zope time over and over within a single transaction, and you'll always have the same timestamp.
Okay.
So there's no different, and I believe that's what's used to record the transaction time.
Okay.
But I'm not positive.
Yeah,
So I think the start of transaction is basically what you get recorded.
So if the start of transaction is what's recorded, then we're in great shape. If it's the end of transaction, I can't predict when the transaction time ends. I'll need to find out. One way or another, I think I can have a workaround if it becomes a problem. Yes.
Hector Velada presented the site I did for the Brazilian government for the Olympics, and they also created an add-on, just the auditing part, the collective.finger pointing. So you might want to look at that.
Say that again?
Collective.finger pointing.
Okay, finger pointing, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, so,
They probably had another use case.
yeah, and I have looked at that before.
You have looked at that. Okay.
Yes. And other related things, I think Wildcard in their Castle CMS has some facility for undo. But basically what I think they're doing is they are, when you delete an item, they're actually just marking it as an invisible, and they're changing the ID of it or something to that degree. So they're not actually truly deleting the item. So it's like half deleted in a way by basically hiding it from you. So there's some kind of like pseudo trash bin functionality there. That's a different approach. It's not an invalid approach. This is just a little bit more aggressive.
Another question, I'm wondering why you need this event log, because all the information should be already available. For example, if you click on the undo button in the ZMI, even if you move an item, I think you have both paths available, so this information should somehow be already available, I guess.
So if you're undoing something in the ZMI,
Yeah.
what's the problem again?
You have an event log. In the beginning, you were proposing to write an event log where
Yes.
you record all the changes.
That's
But
correct.
The changes are already recorded, so what's the difference between
The difference is that the transaction history isn't capturing some of the things that you need. Now, you might say, hey, the path is being captured in the transaction log. That's not necessarily very useful, and you'll find that what's actually being recorded in the path is a virtual host monster mangled version of the path, which is complicated to deal with. So you can't go into, if you have an admin URL and you have your front-end URL and the change happened on one or the other, you can't go into the other URL and figure out the relative path in relationship. It becomes complicated. So my advice is not to trust the path that's necessarily stored in the transaction history. Doing this at the application level does make some sense. Instead of using the database's history. The other thing that the database lacks is the ability to tell us, it might tell us what user and what path. It doesn't necessarily give us the ability to add on any extra metadata that we might find useful for filtering. So, for example, I want to be able to restore, I want to be able to track back to what, this item was deleted because the parent of that item was deleted. And I have one transaction in ZODB that says, folder A was deleted, but inside folder A was folder B, folder C, and 82 items. Those are all sort of buried under the obscure one single transaction record. Because when I do iObject removed event, when I notify object removed event, I get a cascade of these things recursively down to all the removed objects. While that makes things slower because I have to notify things for all those objects, but that's an expected cost of removing a whole folder with subfolders and content and other things inside it.
But you do have the physical path recorded in the undo history path.
The physical path of the one thing you removed,
Yeah.
or the one thing the place where you made the modification. But if that place contained 82 other items, the existence of those 82 other items they're gone. You don't know that they were there. And searching through transactions is very tricky because using transaction iterators to find things is probably going to be 10 times slower than having an application log where we'll potentially find the pain points and say, hey, we really need to index these things by path. Mm-hmm. So we have some flexibility from an optimization standpoint. If we find anything is slow, doing it at the application level provides very little additional cost. So yeah, we're storing some of the same information twice. Once in the transaction record and once in some B tree somewhere on an annotation on the site. But these are small records, and the cost of that from a storage standpoint is low. The cost of it from a performance standpoint, we'll see. Okay. Okay. One more.
So what you're proposing basically is single object restoration instead of transactional undo. So how would you deal with the consistency issues if you're going to make this user-facing? Because when an object gets added, for example, there might be event handlers attached to the creation event that trigger something else. Some reference to the object gets created. some
That
other stuff gets
that's
updated.
very true.
That's gotta
So
be kind of scope.
here's my thinking about those different facilities. Addition, we probably don't necessarily need to use the undo log to unadd something. We already have a nice facility for just deleting the content. So it's just useful from an audit logging standpoint. Modifications, sometimes we have history that gives us what we need. We're potentially logging some additional history. That's somewhat duplicative, but if you're saying, hey, you know, we have this subscriber that does these things, when you delete the item, it does something else, and content rules, for example, could be running, and I can't know about those things. I'm hoping this is general enough that it's solving 98% of the problems that people would have with content restoration, and that people would be able to manually work around those the other 2%.
Yeah. And it's still a case of you have to know what you're doing, whether you're using this tool or whether you're deciding if you want to expose it to your site administrators.
And the thing is that I feel like if I can give the site administrator the ability to try to restore this first before coming to me, that I'm going to save myself as a programmer a lot of time. I'm going to save myself as a responsible party for digging into under the hood. If the site or content administrator has the ability to deal with this, they're going to be more savvy to whether or not it worked or not than the average end user. So I'm going to trust my power users to save me a whole lot of time, because if I'm having to invest, you know, scale this up and think human error happens probably at any given site once, twice a month. Something happens, somebody wants something undone. Usually that person just says, oh, oops, I'm going to fix my own problem. Sometimes, you know, if that happens 6 times a year and each time costs me 1 to 3 hours, that's time I want back in my life. So if there's some simple control panel that gives the site administrator the ability to just simply just find and check items to restore, even if it didn't work in 2% of the cases, if it worked most of those cases, it would be a big time saver for me. It would be a big convenience for the users, and it makes us look good, you know, as people who support systems. So,
Thank you
right.
very much.
Thank you.